Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep today into U.S. immigration and foreign policy. You know you guys send us this video, and it really got us thinking. There's just so much going on. From Lebanon to tariffs to Texas. We're going to try to break it all down for you.
Yeah, it's a lot to cover.
Yeah.
But I think if we can understand the nuances of these issues, we can start to see how these seemingly separate events might actually be connected.
Exactly. And the first thing that really jumped out at me was this news about Lebanon. The U.S. granting temporary protected status, or TPS, to Lebanese nationals. It's a big deal, basically. It means that anyone from Lebanon who's already here in the U.S. and can't go back home because of the crisis there, they get a safe haven. Here they get work permits, protection from deportation, the whole 9 yards. But there's a catch. This TPS designation, it has a time limit. It's from November 27th of this year to May 27th, 2026.
Yeah. It's interesting about this time-bound aspect of TPS. Really highlights something crucial. It's meant to be a temporary solution, a bridge during a crisis.
Yeah.
So for this TPS designation to be lifted, the situation in Lebanon would have to improve significantly within that time frame. Otherwise, we could be looking at a whole new set of challenges and decisions as that deadline approaches.
You know, that's a really good point. It makes you think about what happens to those individuals if things in Lebanon don't get better by 2026. But for now, it is a lifeline for many. And it's actually pretty fascinating how the U.S. determines who qualifies for TPS. There's like a whole set of criteria based on things like ongoing armed conflict, environmental disasters, or other extraordinary conditions.
Right, and unfortunately, Lebanon's situation right now, with all the political instability and economic turmoil, kind of ticks all those boxes. It's a reminder that what's happening globally has very real consequences for people. And sometimes seeking refuge in another country becomes the only option.
Absolutely. And the source also points out this specific group within this TPS designation. Lebanese students who are here in the U.S. on F1 visas, you know, a lot of these students, are really struggling financially because of the crisis back home. So the U.S. is stepping in with some extra relief measures. They're allowed to work more hours, take fewer classes, and even look for jobs off campus to, you know, help ease the burden. What do you think about this? What kind of impact could this have on these students and on the U.S. economy as a whole?
Well, it's definitely complicated. On the one hand, these measures are providing some much-needed financial relief for these students. They can stay in school and support themselves while their home country is in turmoil. But this influx of student labor could also have some ripple effects on the U.S. economy. Some industries might benefit from this, you know, having more workers available, while others might see increased competition for jobs. It's a delicate balance, and it's hard to say what the long-term consequences will be.
Yeah, it's a tough situation for sure. And, you know, as you were talking about that sense of uncertainty for those students, it reminded me of something else the source mentioned, the anxiety surrounding Donald Trump's inauguration back in 2017, especially among international students.
Oh, yeah. That was definitely a period of a lot of apprehension, especially for people whose immigration status was tied to specific policies or programs. Like, remember DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. It protected undocumented individuals who were brought to the U.S. as children from deportation. Well, during Trump's campaign, and even into his early presidency, there was a lot of talk about ending DACA, which would have left all those people in a very vulnerable position.
Wow, I hadn't really thought about that connection before. But it makes sense. Both situations involve people who are already here in the U.S. contributing to society, but facing the possibility of having their lives completely upended by policy changes that are totally out of their control. It must have been incredibly stressful for those students back in 2017, not knowing what the future held.
Absolutely, that uncertainty, that feeling of being caught in the crosshairs of political decisions, it resonates with a lot of immigrant communities, regardless of their specific circumstances.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that policies have a human impact, and that impact often goes way beyond the intended target. But speaking of policies with wide-ranging implications, the source also goes into Trump's proposed tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada.
Right, the tariffs. That was a controversial move, especially since it came right after the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement was signed. Yeah, that agreement was all about promoting free trade between the three countries. The timing just seemed kind of contradictory.
Yeah, it does seem like mixed messages. Can you break down for us what tariffs actually are? Like, what are they supposed to do?
Sure. Basically, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. The idea is to make those foreign products more expensive so that people will choose to buy stuff made here in the U.S. instead. It's a form of protectionism meant to shield domestic industries from foreign competition. and hopefully boost local production and jobs.
So the idea is to help American businesses and workers. But the source says this move got a lot of pushback, especially from Mexico and Canada. What were they worried about?
Well, they were worried about the economic fallout. Both Mexico and Canada have a lot of trade with the U.S., particularly in industries like manufacturing and agriculture. And these tariffs threaten to disrupt those industries, leading to job losses and economic instability. On both sides of the border, Doug Ford, who was the premier of Ontario at the time, warned that these tariffs could be devastating for workers, not just in Canada, but in the U.S. too.
It sounds like a classic example of unintended consequences. You try to help one group, and you end up hurting another, and the ripple effects can be felt everywhere.
Exactly. And it really highlights the interconnectedness of the global economy. When one country starts putting up protectionist policies like tariffs, it rarely affects just that one country. It creates this domino effect where other countries retaliate with their own tariffs, and that's what we call a trade war.
And trade wars never really have winners, do they? They disrupt global supply chains, make goods more expensive for everyone, and create a lot of uncertainty in the market.
Right. It's a reminder that in today's world, economic decisions made in one country can have huge consequences for others, often in ways that are hard to predict.
Okay, so we've got potential economic fallout, strained relationships between countries. But what does all this mean for the average person listening right now? How could these tariff disputes actually affect their everyday lives?
That's a great question. And it's one we should all be asking ourselves. Think about the things you buy on a regular basis, the products you rely on. A lot of those products might be imported from places like China, Mexico, or Canada. When tariffs are imposed, those import costs go up. And those costs are often passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. You might see your grocery bill go up, or the price of electronics increase.
Well, I hadn't really thought about it that way. But it makes total sense. These political decisions about tariffs, they can actually hit us right in the wallet.
Exactly. It just shows how important it is to stay informed about these issues and to understand how they might impact us directly. It's easy to dismiss this stuff as just political maneuvering, but it can have very real consequences for our daily lives.
Now, switching gears a bit, the source also mentions something pretty surprising about Texas. Apparently, they offered up 1,400 acres of land for the construction of detention facilities to support Trump's immigration policies. It was all part of this plan for increased deportations.
Yeah, that proposal caused a lot of debate. There were concerns about the legal side of things and the logistics of actually building and operating these huge detention facilities. And the source points out that a lot of the details were left pretty vague.
Yeah, it seems like there were a lot of unanswered questions, like who would build these facilities, how would they be run, and most importantly, what kind of conditions would the people being detained face? It definitely raises some serious ethical and humanitarian concerns.
Absolutely. And speaks to this broader tension within immigration policy. How do you balance the need for border security and enforcement with the human rights of individuals who are just trying to find a better life?
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, and it's one that deserves careful consideration and thoughtful dialogue.
I agree. And I think it's important to remember that these discussions about detention centers, TPS, and tariffs, they're all connected. They all reflect this bigger debate about America's role in the world, its relationships with other countries, and how it chooses to address complex issues like immigration.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground already, from Lebanon to tariffs to detention centers, and it feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this whole intricate web of U.S. immigration and foreign policy.
We have. I think this is a good place to pause. Let everything sink in a bit. When we come back, we'll delve a little deeper into some of these topics and explore some of the underlying trends and forces at play. So as we dig deeper into all of this, it becomes clear that there are no easy answers. We're talking about balancing national interests with global responsibilities, economic considerations with human rights. It's complicated.
For sure. And one of the things that really struck me in all of this was this recurring theme of uncertainty, especially for the people whose lives are directly impacted by these policy shifts. Like we talked about those Lebanese students facing financial hardship and the anxiety that international students felt back in 2017 when Trump took office.
Yeah, those travel advisories from universities like UMass and MIT, they really highlight that sense of vulnerability. Imagine being a student, far from home, trying to get an education, and suddenly you feel like everything could be taken away from you because of some political decision that you have no control over.
Yeah. It's like a domino effect. One political action leads to another, and the ripple effects can be felt far and wide, impacting people and communities. in ways that are hard to predict.
Exactly. And those ripple effects often go beyond national borders. Like, think about those proposed tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada. The goal was to protect American industries and jobs. But there was a real risk of retaliation from those countries.
It's like a game of chicken, with each country trying to outmaneuver the other, but in the end, it's the everyday people who end up paying the price.
You got it. And the source really drives that point home, with Doug Ford's warning about the devastating impact those tariffs could have on workers. In both Canada and the US, it just shows how interconnected our economies are and how actions taken in one country can have unintended consequences for others.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, are there other ways to address these economic concerns without resorting to these kind of tit-for-tat measures that end up hurting everyone?
There are definitely other options, and that's where diplomacy and international cooperation come in. Finding ways to work together to address shared challenges instead of retreating into these protectionist policies that ultimately just create more division and instability.
That makes a lot of sense. But I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the human cost of political decisions. We talked about the anxiety felt by international students. But the source also highlights another group that was directly impacted by Trump's immigration policies: undocumented migrants. Remember that proposal from Texas to offer up land for detention facilities?
Oh yeah, that was a controversial one. It raised a lot of questions about the ethics and legality of detaining people, often for long periods, while their cases are being processed.
And it's important to remember, we're not just talking about abstract legal cases here. These are real people with families, stories, dreams, being detained, even temporarily. It can be a traumatic experience, especially for people who are fleeing violence or persecution in their home countries.
Absolutely. And that's where the whole conversation about detention centers gets really tricky. You have the argument for border security and enforcing immigration laws, but then you also have the moral obligation to treat everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their immigration status.
It's like trying to balance two competing priorities, and there's no easy solution. But the source does point out that a lot of the details about this proposed detention facilities in Texas were left pretty vague, which raises concerns about transparency and accountability.
Right, there were questions about who would build them, who would run them, and what kind of conditions the detainees would face. These are all really important things to consider when you're talking about taking away someone's freedom, even if it's temporary.
It makes you think about the potential for abuse, human rights violations, the psychological impact on the people who are detained.
Definitely. And that's why it's so important to have open and honest conversations about this, to weigh the costs and benefits, and to make sure that any policies we put in place are both effective and humane.
You know, as we go through all of this, it's becoming clear that all of these seemingly separate issues, TPS for Lebanese nationals, anxiety among international students, trade wars, detention centers, they're all connected in some way. They all reflect these broader debates about immigration, globalization, and America's role in the world.
Absolutely. They all touch on these fundamental questions about national identity, economic security, and the balance between individual rights and collective responsibilities.
It's a lot to think about, and I think this is a good place to take a break, catch our breath, and when we come back, we'll try to pull out some key takeaways and maybe explore some potential paths forward.
As we kind of wrap up this deep dive into U.S. immigration and foreign policy, one thing that really sticks out to me, just how complicated all of this is. There's no single story, no easy fix. It's like this tapestry woven together from economics, politics, human rights, and global interconnectedness.
You know, you're so right. We've covered so much, from Lebanon to tariffs to detention centers. But for me, the biggest takeaway is the human element. Behind every policy, every headline, there are real people whose lives are being changed, often in really big ways.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Like, think about those Lebanese students here in the U.S. who can now work more and get off-campus jobs to help support their families back home. That small change, it can make all the difference for them. It can help them stay in school and get through this.
It's like a reminder that even in the middle of all this geopolitical stuff, there's still room for compassion, for finding ways to help, even in small ways.
Absolutely. It also highlights those ripple effects I was talking about.
Yeah.
Decisions made in Washington can directly impact people and communities all over the world, sometimes in ways we don't even expect.
Right. Like, remember Doug Ford's warning about those tariffs, how they could devastate workers in both Canada and the U.S.? It shows how connected our economies really are and how we need to think about the bigger picture.
Exactly. And it kind of makes me wonder, where do you think the line should be drawn between what's good for our country and what's good for the world? How do we balance protecting our own people while also recognizing that we're all global citizens?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that each of us needs to answer for ourselves. There's no easy answer. But by staying informed, talking to each other, and really listening to different perspectives, we can start to create a more just and equitable world.
I like that. And remember, even small actions can have a big impact. Staying informed, supporting organizations that are making a difference, just talking about these issues with your friends and family, it all adds up.
Totally. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something and that it got you thinking. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep trying to make the world a better place.
Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel US Immigration News. We hope you are doing great. Well, in today's video, we will be talking about US immigration and foreign policy measures and global tensions and domestic concern. The US Department of Homeland Security has designated Lebanon for a temporary protected status from November 27, 2024 to May 27, 2026 due to the severe political and economic crisis in Lebanon. This designation allows eligible Lebanese nationals in the US to apply for work permits, travel authorization, and protection from deportation, providing crucial relief during Lebanon's ongoing instability. In addition, the US has introduced a separate relief program for Lebanese students on F1 visas who are facing financial hardship. The program allows these students to work more hours, reduce their class load, and apply for off-campus jobs to help ease the economic burden. Both TPS and the student relief application processes are set to open on November 27, 2024. Amid fears surrounding President-elect Donald Trump, deportation plans US universities such as the University of Massachusetts and MIT issued travel advisors urging international students and staff to return to campus before Trump's inauguration in January 2017. The uncertainty stemmed from the potential for mass deportation, especially after Trump's past statements and proposals to end deferred action for childhood arrivals, which protected undocumented students. This led to widespread anxiety, particularly among students from Asia and other vulnerable countries who were concerned about changes to immigration policies that could threaten their ability to stay in the US and continue their education. On the trade front, President-elect Trump pleased to impose new tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada on his first day in office provoked sharp criticism from officials in all three countries. His plan, which was a mean to address issues such as illegal immigration and drug trafficking, was seen as a violation of the recently negotiated US-Mexico-Canada agreement. China rejected Trump's claim, while Mexico and Canada warned that such tariffs could have a severe economic consequences for industries that rely heavily on cross-border trade. Mexico Finance Ministry specifically raised concern about the damage to shared industries, particularly manufacturing and agriculture. Canada's Premier Doug Ford also expressed strong opposition, calling the tariffs devastating for workers on both sides of the border, heightening the trade tensions between the countries. In Texas, state authorities offered President Trump 1,400 acres of land along the US-Mexico border to construct detention facilities for processing and detaining undocumented migrants as part of his broader plan for mass deportations. The proposal, which received support from local officials, faced opposition and potential legal challenges, especially as the specifics of the detention centers remained unclear. Governors in other border states, particularly those with a democratic leadership, voiced a strong opposition, citing concern over the legal and humanitarian implication of such facilities, which added to the growing divide over immigration enforcement policies in the US.